My name is Bill Randall, and I'm a professor of gerontology here at St. Thomas University, and a proud member of the coordinating team for our Center for Interdisciplinary Research on Narrative, otherwise affectionately known as CERN. So on behalf of my CERN colleagues, Clive Baldwin, Marcia Ingersoll, Matt Robinson, Beth McKim, Dolores Furlong, Michelle LaFrance, and from a distance, Sue Mackenzie Moore, plus others that are sprinkled, Go Beliscan. Sorry, I pronounced your name correctly, Go. Okay, good. And others who are affiliated in one way or another with CERN and sprinkled around the world. It is my pleasure and my honor to welcome you to the 2017 John McKendy Memorial Lecture on Narrative. Until John McKendy's untimely death in November of 2008, he was a beloved member of the St. Thomas University community and a founding member of CERN. And it was John's dream from the get-go that we would one day be able to do a couple of things. One is to launch an online peer-reviewed journal that would be devoted to narrative themes. And the second was to attract a Canada Research Chair in Narrative Studies. And both dreams have now become a reality, I'm happy to report. For more information, and this is a bit of a plug, about the journal, which is entitled Narrative Works. What's the second part of the title?
You put me on the spot.
Issues,
investigations and
interventions. Narrative Work. Anyway, which is just published. Beth and I are co-editors of it. Just published the 12th issue. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. And we ask you to invite you to visit our website, the CERN website, and then zero in on Narrative Works. And I'm happy to report that we're hoping to have our speaker's presentation as a video tonight available on Narrative Works in the months to come, and also the text of her talk as an article in the journal Narrative Works. That's very exciting for us. So thank you, all of you, for coming. A special thanks to Carol and Judy and members of John's family. Also thanks to Lauren Eagle, of course, for handling much of the late work for Dr. Ruffing's visit. I should just mention that for those of you who have some time tomorrow between 12 o'clock and 2 o'clock, we're going to be gathering informally with Dr. Ruffing in our Narrative Center, which is in this very building on the 3rd floor, room 313. So come and hang out with us over coffee and nibblies of whatever sort, and we'll continue the conversation with Dr. Ruffing about some of the themes that she'll be talking about this evening. I might just remind you that because this is a public talk, it'd be awfully great if you could put your cell phones onto mute mode or vibrate or whatever would be appropriate. So now, to introduce our 2017 McKendy Lecture, I'm pleased to call upon colleague and friend Clive Baldwin, who is Canada Research Chair in Narrative Studies, Director of CERN, a marvelous colleague with a mind that knows narrative inside and out. So, Clive, take it away.
Good evening. One of the aims of CERN is to promote narrative inquiry and practice, both within the university and beyond. And an important part of that is the annual McKendy Lecture on narrative. With the growth and interest in narrative across disciplines, we at CERN have tried over the years to represent narrative's range in the speakers we invite to deliver the annual lecture. In the past we've heard from scholars and others about how narrative contributes to our understanding of psychiatry, human rights, trafficking, life stories, social justice and other important areas. Tonight we continue in this vein with our speaker, Dr. Janet Ruffing, Sister of Mercy and Professor in the Practice of Spirituality and Ministerial Leadership at Yale University. She's the author of 2 books on narrative and spiritual direction, To Tell a Sacred Tale and Uncovering Stories of Faith. I first came across Dr. Ruffing's work when I was writing an article on ageing narrative and spirituality. I was glad to have done so. Her work has influenced my understanding of how narrative and spirituality interact and inform both the design and the conduct of my current study on spiritual identity among members of new religious movements. There's relatively little written on spirituality and narrative, and despite what is termed the narrative turn and the oft-heard claim of narrative scholars that narrative is an interdisciplinary approach, there is all too often little cross-fertilisation of ideas between narrative scholars in different disciplines. And there are still areas in which narrative potential is still to be recognised. The McKendy lecture is an opportunity to extend our understanding of how narrative might contribute to understanding ourselves, others, and the world, and to provide space in which new areas of narrative understanding might be explored. And tonight is one such occasion. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Janet Ruffing.
I think I need to turn my own phone off.
Yes, please do that.
I would not be happy in my own classroom. So pardon that little interruption here. I have been interested in stories and storytelling most of my life. We live in a storied world, whether we notice this or not. From our earliest conscious lives, we hear stories about ourselves, our families, our communities, our cultures, our ancestors in faith, and about our place in these stories. My mother was our family storyteller and the keeper of ancestral stories. She also exemplified for us how one could change one's own story. She began college and then a teaching career when my brother and I were close to our own college years, before such midlife transitions were common. When the elementary school principal she worked for as a secretary recognized the teacher in her and encouraged her to enroll in the local community college, she decided to go for it, initiating the next 17 years of her life. If we are lucky, we might also hear and read stories that are about people and cultures and religions that differ from our own. Even better is meeting such people firsthand, as we did through our mom's classmates at Cal State San Francisco. We discover through stories and firsthand experiences the difference culture makes and the difference that ethnicity, race, gender, religion, wealth, or sexual orientation make in our lives and in those we meet. Many of us take these experiences and our narrative process for granted, as well as the fact that we primarily understand ourselves through the stories we tell about ourselves, as well as the stories of those who differ from us. As a 20-something Sister of Mercy in California during the late 60s, I was an English and religion teacher in Catholic secondary schools before I began my doctoral studies in spirituality more than 10 years later. I was astounded to discover that the literature about this burgeoning field of spiritual direction, specialized accompaniment of people in their spiritual lives, rarely alluded to the fact that spiritual direction itself is inherently a narrative process, regardless of what else it is and what explicit model of direction the director espouses. It all unfolds in stories. It was obvious to me that directees were narrating their spiritual autobiographies from session to session, revising their inherited story in the light of new experience, and creating new chapters in their spiritual lives as we went along. Narrative theologians offered some clues. Psychotherapists were beginning to incorporate narrative theories into their work and continue to do so today. And hermeneutics accounted for some of these narrative processes. This interdisciplinary work brought attention to the role of narrative in the formation of identity. This appears to be so true that it's a little scary to me, I don't know about to you, our identities appear to be narrative creations. We make them up, and we rehearse them over our lifetimes, revising and adapting them to account for new experiences and changes in our self-understanding that result from these changes. To use religious language, conversion may not be too strong a word to point to major changes in our sense of self and our orientation to reality. Sometimes we like to call it development. It's all narrative. This is particularly true in relationships to changes in our denominational stories and interpretations of Scripture, which provide an explicitly religious worldview within which we create our own sacred stories. So our stories take place inside of other stories. But so too do various stage theories of psychological development or growth describe ordinary age-specific psychological maturity. Since our self-understandings are always partial and limited by the level of our maturity when we developed our core stories, we may overlook or neglect the significance of some actual events and our responses to them that we can understand and appropriate only later. Think about all the things you didn't understand when you were little, and that finally came into focus, and you could then incorporate them into your story. When we arrive at increasingly nuanced understandings of our identity narratives, we may become free to revise long-standing assumptions about what happened that contributed to this identity and begin to fashion a new, more complex and nuanced autobiographical story. Ever sit down at a family table and discover nobody else remembers it like you do? Many stories of the very same experience. In the context of spiritual direction, we can define this particular narrative as an episodic spiritual autobiography co-created within the narrative opportunity of the spiritual direction conversation. It's one of the few non-pathological conversations we can have because it's not stigmatized, it's a base story. And so it creates a space for us to discover, let me describe what happened. The stories told and new things emerge. Today, there are new insights and experiences that inform our sense of self, what we may have learned about our ancestry, either genetically or historically, the places or landscapes that have shaped us, and in many places in the world, competing narratives about our national myths. These impel those of us who can manage this level of self-critical reflection to revise our stories or to get another story from the abundance of available stories that can redeem our personal and collective past and free us to create more fulsome identities that align with our moral compass and support our growth in grace and in God's life in us. Let me make this a little more concrete for us. So what do we know and how do we feel about it when we reflect on our own family backgrounds and the ancestry that we come to know or what we come to know through genetics? There's an even newer phenomenon called epigenetics now, which is how we pass things on, not even through genetics or story, but traits actually get passed on in a way that we don't know how, we just know that it does at this point. But it's a whole new field that one of my friends let me know about. So there's much that is kind of mysterious about this. If we are honest, none of us has a completely exemplary background. We may want to claim our ancestry, but when we get into it, we may not be too sure that we want this to be part of us. Our family histories are complex, incomplete, and not necessarily accurate, nor are any of us the product of a perfect family. But these stories serve a useful purpose of contextualizing our lives within a larger familiar context. The stories that we share are often highly selective, and often they are those that flatter us, or uncritically justify past ancestral choices, when they really weren't as bad as they said, and which enhance our sense of self. So we tend to like the good bits and leave out the problematic ones. Some of the omissions are unintentional, and others are not. We have access to records today that previously would have taken much time and energy and financial resources to pursue, and some information was deliberately lost, forgotten, or creatively reinterpreted under the pressure of immigration and complicated life stories. Everybody didn't put the full story down on their documents, even if they knew what it was. White family histories are a microcosm of European and North American colonial history, and they are nested within our specific cultural histories. My own includes primarily early British colonialist adventures and a later immigration caused by massive crop failure near the city of Trent and German imperialism in the late 19th and early 20th century, which led to some Austrian and Scandinavian immigration. Canadians share a similar history on the British side, while your French colonial history affects you nationally much more strongly than it does ours. And both our countries have an ambiguous, troubled, and unresolved relationship with our First Nation peoples. Recently, I have been wondering what is different about Canadian history and culture that has enabled you to collectively acknowledge the injustice of your treatment of First Nation peoples in gestures of reconciliation, while our national myth supports our continuing mistreatment of Native Americans when members of the dominant Euro-American culture want resources that lie in protected lands or the lands themselves. In addition, both Americans and Canadians are now far more ethnically diverse than ever before, as we've welcomed immigrants in the 20th and 21st centuries from Asia, Latin and South America, the Middle East, and increasingly the African subcontinent. This suggests we will continue to incorporate a greater variety of ancestral stories into that of our countries and our dominant national mythic story. We're still needing to create more of that story. In the U.S., you can tell what my preoccupations have been in this latest nightmare we're living through. In the U.S., suddenly some groups of white people think they are endangered and must close borders and reignite an old pattern of American nativism that has periodically emerged in our national history. When those newcomers in the late 19th and early 20th century were Southern Europeans, This response was based on skin color ethnically and religion. So Southern Europeans, olive complected, and Irish, who were both often Catholics in the 19th century. And now it is the response to Muslims, Asians, Latin and South Americans. And of course we forget that we took a big bunch of land from the South Americans, from the Mexicans. So it is a blatant form of racism and religious intolerance which exposes attitudes and expectations rooted in white privilege that appear to be threatened. So whose story is threatened? Whose life is threatened? It seems to be an experience of those who have unconsciously benefited from this white privilege since colonial times to be confronted with its taken-for-granted systemic aspects that have only partially unraveled since the end of our Civil War and who have received an intentionally substandard education reinforcing these views. I thought we had a standard curriculum. We don't. We don't. I mean, the books are not the same, and the history that's being taught is not the same. So the point of this is we live our personal stories inside of a larger national story, or inside a subset of that national story. And this is just the air we breathe and the atmosphere we take for granted. It's thus the myth that justifies these attitudes and behaviors is widely shared in an uncritical manner and reinforces the personal identities of those who incorporate it into their personal stories. So you get a larger affirmation of what you secretly thought, but really don't know the history. On the popular and political level at present in the US, we seem to have some mysterious amnesia about how our actions militarily, economically, and ecologically all over the world contribute to this immigration we're trying to stop. Earlier, again, the selectiveness of the story. Important parts of the story are being left out. Earlier in the fall, the upsurge of aggressive white supremacy and its anti-Jewish and racist ideology has not been seen in such public display since the 1960s. Some narratives of hate and exclusion go underground only to reignite when perceptions of exclusion, economic distress, and substandard education lead some susceptible people to call for exclusion, while they feel completely innocent about the systemic racism, which has not yet been dismantled in the US, although the discriminatory behavior of many has changed. Legal frameworks have been created to prohibit such discriminatory behavior, but that has not necessarily changed people's internal narratives about it. The law has changed, but the story has not. This is a sad and disturbing time because prominent governmental leaders evoke and reinforce this deeply flawed narrative and fail to offer an alternative national narrative or model the behavior it requires based on our founding ideals and principles of inclusion into which we are still very much growing. We appear to be deeply confused about the distinctions between the storylines about who we are and aspire to be, which convey our inclusive civic and national ideals, and those which are now surprisingly based on alternative facts, as shorthand for ahistorical, fact-free, false narratives, which are proving to be more stubborn than those based on actual events, historical or scientific fact, let alone on morality and mutual respect for difference. Deliberately false narratives. So it matters deeply how we tell the story, who tells the story, and how well we are educated in alternative stories. It's a leap of consciousness to be able to recognize there are alternative stories. There isn't just one story. And when a variety of alternative stories, not the non-factual ones, are left out, everything gets skewed. We also need to acknowledge that within a Christian context that we have appropriated and misappropriated biblical texts in ways that support these same false narratives. Conservative Catholics and some white evangelicals read biblical texts selectively and preach them in ways that refuse to accept legitimate diversity, the rights of others, freedom of conscience, and contested moral issues. The prosperity gospel bears little resemblance to the actual teachings of Jesus and is devoid of any sense of the common good as an essential principle of social justice, which extends beyond private morality. At the same time, gospel-inspired Amish community in Pennsylvania and African Americans in a Bible study program in Charlotte, North Carolina, read the scripture and rise to forgiveness. The same scriptures. These stories continue to stir us because they call us to a genuinely gospel way of life. So we have a conflict of interpretations right within our guiding biblical texts when we don't like parts of the story that are emerging in the present context and as we understand our scriptures with greater accuracy. Within Catholicism, more than 50 years after Vatican II, we continue to experience a conflict of interpretations of this global reorientation of Catholic faith and practice to the heart of the gospel. And these include a sense of world church, the rights and dignity of women, the necessity and right to follow one's own informed conscience, a robust ecumenism and interfaith dialogue, and social justice teachings which critique unbridled global capitalism, indiscriminate use of military force, and the harm done to our common home as we refuse to protect the very conditions of human life on a sustainable earth. And so we have folks that are on both sides of everything here. So it's not, I'm giving you the Catholic side as well as the biblical side because this is happening within every form of religion and religious community. I leave it to you to critique the conflicts within your own appropriations of the gospel in your specific traditions and the way this plays out in relationship to economic, environmental, and respect, or not, for various forms of diversity. We are indeed in over our heads, as Robert Keegan so aptly pointed out, developmentally and religiously, if we are insufficiently educated to deal with the complexity of our world and its web of interconnections. We, interestingly enough, require more sophisticated stories, not less sophisticated stories, because of the complexity of our interconnected world. So, adequate, age-appropriate education is usually required to achieve these adult capacities for reflection that our complex societies require. Otherwise, the narratives, the stories within which many adults live cannot change. What is amazing to me right now is how stubborn the stories stay, regardless of what we know from other sources. So the story sticks and stays and influences our behavior in ways that I don't know, I've gone through so many changes. I don't feel that stuck. So why are all these other people stuck in a story that no longer fits who we are or what the conditions of our lives are at this point? I want to shift from the current distressing distortion of my U.S. national story. It's long enough. That's it. To personal and familial stories that illustrate some of this reframing and re-understanding. So I want to give you a couple of examples from my own family history. My grandmother, pictured here with her youngest, who was mostly Scandinavian, told a story well into her 90s. What she said over and over again was soon after her mother died, when she was 8 or 9 years old, her father, a rough carpenter, moved the family from Tacoma, Washington to a homestead in Okanagan. She recounted that a man rode up to their place on horseback and asked her father if he had a daughter he could spare, because his wife needed help in the kitchen. And her father said, without consulting her, "You can have Edie." The slide is a picture of an old homestead in Okanagan. It's not theirs necessarily, but it just gives you a sense of the place. She was packed up and rode off on the back of this stranger's horse a few hours later. Her mother had just died. And she was separated from her older siblings who were about 18, 19 years of age at the time. And she would say to me, what kind of a father would give her daughter to a stranger without even meeting the woman she was supposed to help or going to look at the place? Now, this was only one uncomplimentary story about my great-grandfather, which leads me to believe that there was some truth about her assessment of him. But is this the whole story? It was certainly all she knew, and she somehow managed to survive it, but it caused her to question the character of her father. My brother, who is now retired, a retired international economist, who spends far more time on our genealogy than I have time to do, found census records online which suggested a surprisingly different interpretation. The census shortly after that incident revealed that Jens was listed as a carpenter, living nearby, and only the 2 older siblings were on the homestead. My brother argued if the homestead were succeeding, Jens would have been there and not working for wages elsewhere. If my grandmother had known that her father might have been trying to provide for her well-being, she was too little to help with the farm work, rather than abandoning her to strangers, she might have felt differently about him and this painful and alienating separation from her siblings. But, as I said, it haunted her well into her 90s. To offer another personal story of being affected by recently discovered ancestry information, Edith married my grandfather, who was a Folsom. Now, we have a 3-volume family history that goes back to about 50 years after the establishment of Massachusetts Bay Colony. John Folsom and his family were involved in desecrating the Anglican Church in Higham, England, and after paying fines, sailed with about 50 others involved in this incident to settle in Higham, Massachusetts. In the U.S., every Folsom is interrelated in some way. My grandparents, however, were economically insecure and barely managed to survive the Great Depression during the 1930s in the West, even though my grandfather was a skilled worker. Having grown up in the West in a modest middle-class family, I have never had pretensions to privilege. Education was highly valued, but my parents both attended a business school because they could not afford college, and married within the year. Met in October and married in May of the same year. My mother earned her BA at Cal State San Francisco when I was in the 9th grade. My brother earned his PhD in economics at Columbia University about 9 years after Mother graduated from college. But at the time, I did not know this was an Ivy League school or what that possibly represented. He just went off to graduate school. When visiting my brother, Ken, one Christmas vacation, he opened Genie.com and said, let's look at the New England branch of the family. When I was hired by Yale in 2010, there were many times I wondered how I ended up here. When I proclaimed the gospel in the First Congregational Church in New Haven for one of my students' ordination, I really spookily wondered how the divines felt about this Roman Catholic sister in their pulpit, even as I was proclaiming the very long gospel of Dives, Lazarus and Dives. When Ken and I looked at the genealogy, we discovered we were 11th cousins to Elihu Yale, who had donated the land for his divinity school. See what I mean by missing information? Now, this unexpected information suggested that maybe I did have some familial right or destiny to be at Yale. Now, when I think that way, I tend to minimize in this story the fact that I had a 23-year history of graduate teaching at Fordham, a Tier 1 research institution, a solid publication record, or you don't get to stay, as you all know, and held the rank of a tenured full professor already for about a dozen years. Now, I am also only the second Catholic sister to teach in the Divinity School. And although I have enjoyed my work enormously at Yale and the many new experiences that I have enjoyed, my values as a Catholic sister lead me to sit lightly with this prestigious appointment. Before this ancestral discovery, I had already made a choice not to attach to the deference and privilege which comes to me purely by the fact of this appointment. I've been valued at Yale because of the quality of my teaching, the field the school wanted to add to the curriculum, and my wildly ecumenical background, and my years of experience of teaching internationals from all over the world, the majority from Africa and Asia, while at Fordham. The Divinity School was not very diverse in terms of students when I arrived. It looks very different today, not due to me, but I just know how to teach them. I mean, it helps. These aspects of my profession are more important to me than the privilege that comes from working in this elite place. For me, this is a conscious, ethical, and spiritual choice. My ancestry does not make me a better, more faithful Christian. My life and my choices do that. I enjoy my work with my students and faculty colleagues, but I have not raised my standard of living because I'm a Sister of Mercy and live accordingly. And they're happy for my very large salary. I do enjoy the cultural and educational opportunities that come with this appointment. When I retire and return to California, the privilege will be over. And these 10 or so Yale years will recede into the background, except for the memories of the many students whose lives I've influenced in significant ways. So you're hearing some of the framing of my own story. So in my life story, this will likely be the last chapter of my graduate academic career. And another chapter of my story as a Sister of Mercy will begin in California after 34 years on this East Coast. So it's a very clear ending, and a whole new chapter is yet to be developed when it's revealed to me what it's going to be. From this perspective now of spiritual direction, how I think about and relate to this current experience is less about unearned ancestral privilege or blame, and more about the conscious choices which define my character and the consistent daily experience of how God's grace and compassion move in and through me in unexpected and surprising ways at school. This is a narrative of grace, of how God opened my way to both of my postdoctoral appointments when I personally preferred to stay on the West Coast, and applied actually 3 times to West Coast universities when I was trying to care for my parents from New York. So this is a narrative of mission, of character, and hard work, which I take for granted. In this professional role, I have been able to support the growth in grace and spiritual maturity of students and others in my community to a fuller appropriation of relationship with God in their personal vocations. These are the themes that appear in my personal spiritual direction narratives. I apologize for the overly personal sharing, perhaps, but I didn't have another case I could use ethically. So I decided to kind of show you how these are weaving together in my own experience. These are, so the story of grace and spirit that unfold in this social location, namely Yale, have little to do with my ancestry, which was certainly more accidental than causal. But it's entirely possible that ancestry might figure more strongly in the direction narratives of someone else. So I'm not trying to make a universal statement here. I believe we will perhaps be judged less by our ancestry than by how we have lived our lives in relationship to it. So what have we made out of our ancestry? Whatever shape that life story might have taken. I also don't think very much about being judged. That's not a really strong thing. But I'm trying to say there what really matters is what are the conscious choices we personally made in relationship to the circumstances into which we were born and which has shaped us. Now I want to go to places and landscapes as another source of narrative material. The spiritual tradition relates to the physical geography of our lives in complex and interrelated ways. Each of us is shaped profoundly by our natal environments and by the physical places where we have lived. So these places become integrally parts of our story, and we frequently don't even notice that we're storying them, that we're turning them into story, because the places and landscapes don't speak. So within Christian theology, the natural world is our home and a place in which we often experience God. The creation is God's first sacrament and universally available to every human being, regardless of religion or beliefs. Of itself, the natural world needs us to tell its story of cosmic unfolding, as well as to tell the story of grace when our personal theophanies occur in specific landscapes and are mediated through the natural world. Now think about the places, the beautiful places, the scary places where you have met God. It is you who have to tell that story. The places do not. In Christian theology, God reveals God's self through the natural world, and this natural world is God's first and universal revelation to all people. This comes before any scripture. Specific places become sacred because of our felt sense of connection with and communication with God in specific places. God, as experienced in Judaism and Christianity, is not limited to one place, while at the same time, God can reveal God's presence or not in specific places. When we go to a specific place, God shows up or not. Often, if God has shown up in a specific place, God shows up there again, because our response is bringing us back to that place in order to meet God there. Anthropologist Keith Basso studied the Apache people's place names and their role in holding and embodying forth the entire history of the people. He says to say the name of a place, to tell a story about a place, is to waken memory, conjure up everything that ever happened there, and make it present again to the community. In this culture, these memories become woven into the personal and collective identity of the people. So the people story the landscape. Further, Basso notes, places possess a marked capacity for triggering acts of self-reflection, inspiring thoughts about who one presently is, or memories of who one used to be, or musings on who one might become. So places kind of trigger our memories. And not just the memories, but reflection on that experience. Robert Adams, writing about landscape photography, suggests something quite similar. These pictures offer three truths, he says: geography, autobiography, and metaphor. Geography, autobiography, and metaphor. Altogether, the three kinds of information strengthen each other and reinforce what we all work to keep intact, an affection for life. We can know places scientifically, know the names of the flora, fauna, geological features in an objective and abstract way. But we relate to these places through an experiential place sense. What does it feel like to be here? This is the imaginative, affective response to a place that allows it to become significant for a person or community. So we have the Hebrew scriptures, God was in this place and I did not know this. And so Jacob builds a shrine at Bethel. So we relate to these places through an experiential place sense. So it seems to me that this experiential place sense is at work in the way we tell stories about the geographical and urban places where we have lived and where we have encountered God within our embodied histories, and hence the spiritual direction story. It's in these specific places where we have experienced God. These places require us to tell their stories and to connect our spiritual sensibilities and experiences with these sacred places. A geologist or biologist can recognize the ecological history of a place over time from informed observation, this layer. But that story of Earth processes is not the same as our stories about the way these places and what has happened to us in them continue to shape us in bodily and spiritual ways. Ulrich Neisser, some time ago, identified this sense of self as, quote, the ecological self, which is present in us from infancy. Where are we physically located in this room in relationship to Mother? It's a physical place sense. This sense of self expands through autobiographical consciousness and becomes part of our identity when we weave stories of place into our narratives. From the perspective of spiritual practice and of spiritual direction, this significance of a sacred sense of place in our lives continues to unfold over time. Each of us has embodied a sense about what kinds of places have nourished our deep connection to God, and we return there. We remember the different kinds of events that happened in these places, sacred encounters, relationships, and the changes in the sense of our physical selves in the process. For those of us who grow up in coastal places, the ocean is a balm to our souls, including the rhythm of the surf, the salty air, the effect on us of fog or sun on a given day, the sensation of the sand under our feet and bodies, water lapping over our feet on the shore, and the thrill of body surfing or floating or swimming in the salt water, which must evoke the comfort of prenatal life in our mother's womb. Our senses immediately respond to these features of place when we arrive. So can you tell I'm Californian? And do fine on the East Coast because it's a coast. I was not so sure I could do Iowa. I lived with another sister who found making a retreat by the ocean was destabilizing for her and made her restless. I couldn't imagine you could have that kind of a response to this sound of the water. She had grown up in the Rocky Mountains, and her sacred sense of God was related to the stability of the mountain and the rootedness of the trees. They don't move anywhere. Not the constantly changing rhythms of coastal surf and sand. Since we were both in California at the time, the immensity of the ocean and rhythms of the surf seemed more spiritually significant to me than the mountains. I think I could grow into this, but it's the ocean. While I can appreciate the transcendent sense of forest and mountains, the open expanses of beautiful coastal areas are my spiritual home. So you might think about where yours are, and where is this for you? I'm not pushing the coast on you, it's to give you a concrete example of how a place becomes really important to us spiritually. Anyone who has directed retreatants at a retreat house hears an incredible variety of stories of grace, uniquely related to each directee and the natural features of the place. Many retreatants made similar discoveries as retreatants who have preceded them. They find the same rock, the same tree, the same sacred place. Others have utterly unique experiences of that landscape as a place of God's presence and self-revelation, completely new, unlike anybody else. So it is always important to explore with directees what their sense of that place is and how they relate to their embodied story of grace. Today, some of us are consciously living in a new story of the universe and have developed an ecological sensibility about nature. Although for some, this non-theistic story, which is often nonetheless full of mystery, suffices for their orientation to this reality. There is an incredible creativity in Christian theology today, accounting for this return to what was once called the Book of Nature. These developments include new conversations between theologians and scientists, as well as retrieving and interpreting neglected things in Scripture, in ways of imaging God in whose likeness we are made, and in an ethical sense of how all the peoples of the earth share a common home, for which we are responsible to preserve and share. For these directees, it is important to help them make connections between the universal story of this evolving and still mysterious universe and their specific religious traditions. One last little part here that I'm calling identity. Various contemporary theories about narratives suggest that our identities are, at their core, narrative accounts of ourselves to ourselves, as well as accounts of ourselves to others. These others may be a spiritual director, a family member, a therapist, a psychologist, a friend, or some other trusted person. Most of us, over time, organize our sense of ourselves through key stories that represent significant events and realizations about ourselves and the kind of person we have become or aspire to become. We rehearse these to ourselves internally if we are highly introverted, and in conversations with multiple others if we are extroverted. It is almost as if we draw on a playlist of key events in our lives that we use to describe the kind of person we are that seems appropriate to each interlocutor. We might share one set of stories with acquaintances, others with close friends, still others with a spiritual director, and others with family members who think they know our narrative identities already because of shared experiences. But it's really telling when we discover major differences in the inside story. We try to get the audience right, and we are selective about what we disclose to others. The narrative situation greatly affects how much we will let others into our identity narratives. So think about who you will share these stories with. Who can you trust with these stories? Writing classes are one place where many young people begin to formally engage in this process. They just have to write essays on certain topics. And it becomes a way of reflecting and a way of thinking about how to frame these stories. Various forms of faith-sharing groups may provide such a narrative situation for this sacred kind of sharing. And spiritual direction is another opportunity in a one-on-one situation in which adult directees entrust their sacred tales to a spiritual director without an expectation of equal sharing. In other words, the directees are free to focus directly on their unique stories of grace at whatever stage of adult and spiritual development they have achieved, facilitated by the interest of the director and the invitations for further elaboration that may elicit the unsaid, which can be story. So there's often a part of our stories we do not say unless someone asks for it. And when it's invited or asked for, it's right there. We know it, but it's not one that we rehearse. There is, of course, so much more that could be said about spiritual direction and identity. In this paper, I'm presuming some familiarity with some of my earlier work on narrative and spiritual direction. And I wanted to develop in more detail the two themes I've explored with you related to new discoveries about ancestry or genetics, to which many directees have access, and which requires some form of assimilation and critical reflection about how they affect a directee's sense of self and destiny, imaginatively or realistically, if at all. And secondly, the role of place or landscape in the conscious sense of our identities and spiritual experience. Neisser asserts this ecological sense of self is present in infancy, but does not elaborate how this figures in adult experience of the sense of self, or how it might be related to our sacred history. My suspicion is that this is more significant for many of us than we realize. Missionaries have told me that when they are adjusting to a new geographical location and culture, that their first sense of being at home there is their relationship to the features of the place itself. The sky is still overhead, the ground is still beneath their feet, and the landscape mediates experiences of God in this new place, even before they can make themselves understood in the new language, nor feel at home in the new culture. So there is a way in which we first become comfortable in the natural world. When directees come for spiritual direction, they have had an experience which they have not yet coherently storied even for themselves. Sometimes these experiences just spring into consciousness in a session. Directees are surprised by the story they had no intention of telling today because it emerged from experience that was not yet fully appropriated. Elsewhere, I've developed these ideas about how the emergence of our spiritual identities, ourselves before God, or as we understand this deepest core of ourselves, continually brings changes on our autobiographical sense of self. The telling of our deepest relational, spiritual, and existentially challenging experiences contributes to restoring our identity narratives over time. Today, that may include more conscious awareness of the influence or not of ancestry and landscapes on our spiritual and cultural identities. These stories of our unfolding identities are not only a co-creation with the spiritual director, but even more importantly, they are co-created, co-authored with God and neighbor. They put us in community, not just in our subjective self. In spiritual direction, the director is both audience and at the same time a profound influence on the narrative of self the directee tells over time. These narratives may be identified as searching narratives as life continues to unfold, not fixed. This is particularly true of young people. They're still trying to find themselves. They're not quite sure who they are yet. So there's a lot of searching and exploration going on. As directees not only create searching narratives, they are also from time to time caught up in the mysterious Holy One, who can never be adequately storied by us, but who changes and transforms our consciousness mystically beyond our self-referent narrative of ourselves. This is not an identity that can be collapsed into our ordinary narratives of spiritual identity. These stories of self and God are characterized by greater and greater coherence and complexity commensurate with adulthood. In this place of greater complexity and adequacy of a coherent spiritual narrative identity, further transformation originates from beyond ourselves, drawing us further into mystery. Hopefully, spiritual directors are attentive to this lore, drawing us and our directees beyond the story we tell about ourselves. And I hope that directees and their directees are hearing the story God is telling us about ourselves. That's it.
Yes, sure.
So
I was giving you the mic.
Oh, such a teacher, I think I don't need a mic. He's my teacher, Lord. Thank you so much. I'd like to open the floor at this moment to ask if we have any questions for Professor Ruffing. Comments also? Yes.
This is mostly comment. I enjoyed the talk very much. And when you said, I think I would have had more trouble adjusting to Iowa
Was that not a good thing to say?
No, not at all. It reminded me of the writer Marilyn Robinson,
Yes.
who essentially said the same thing. She worked at the Iowa Writers Workshop. Was from Massachusetts originally, and said, it took me a long time to learn how to write about Iowa, as in to come to understand what this place is offering and what there is to write about. And of course, she went on to do a wonderful job of it in Gilead and in other books about Iowa. So this is just a sort of strange train of thought that I was on as I was listening to you, that there's actually almost an eerie similarity between some of these elements that basically all of the elements I think you were suggesting today are part of this process of reflective identity formation and narrative, and the book Gilead. I don't know if people have read it. Some have. It's this reflection of an older man back upon his life, which just hugely figures sort of national myths or stories about identity, as well as his own family story, and as well as the place, Iowa. I guess I was struck by the validity of what you were suggesting in the context of that.
In the context of that literary work.
Yeah.
I had done another workshop in Chicago on the place, part of it was this, how God talks to us through nature in a way. And there were folks from Iowa there. And, but it just is like, my attitude toward Iowa, but this changed it. And she said, you can hear the corn growing at a certain time when the crops are ripening. Now, that's a stunning detail, so, and I think that's true of all these different, whatever place is home or whatever place mediates God, there's aspects of that place that if you haven't been there, a photograph can't show you. It's a fully sensory experience. So it's the wind in the trees, or I got run over by a deer once in Oregon because I chose my little place to pray, flaked out on the ground on a deer trail. So I had 2 footprints on my thighs because I was also sunbathing. So now, no one had ever been run over by a deer before on the Little Muskaka River. But it's a kind of, it's a fully sensual, sensate experience that's soulful and mystery. And I was starting a retreat in New York, in Oslo. The first day of the retreat, a deer passed through the woods in front of me. And I actually wrote the poem. I never suddenly so startled. Wrote the poem that I had not written about this encounter with the deer. Because they were, both of those deer appearances were so intimately connected with the experience of God I was having in those places. But it's a really fun story. So the corn growing, and then of course, the way Marilyn Robinson learns the place. So it's also, one can be in a place that one is not impressed with, and it becomes something more when we let it work on us, and when we're open to what that experience is. And that's always changing. So yeah, thank you. That's a lovely, lovely comment. Thank you. Yes.
Is the process of, of narrative, is that the intimate process for myself, to understand myself, or is it a process to share my experience with others?
Well, it's both. I think we as humans learn to say things outside before we learn to do everything inside ourselves. So at this stage of our development, we do an awful lot inside. What my experience is, I kind of did the extrovert-introvert thing. Introverts will rehearse the story a lot inside. and extroverts can't tell the story unless they have an audience. So there's a way in which in, you know, a safe sharing group, whether it's spiritual direction or a faith sharing group, our story, so stories are stimulated in us. I mean, it's like what you just did with Marilyn Robinson. You know, one story leads to another story. One story reminds us of something else. One story evokes. It's not the same story. Okay? So both the internal, we keep repeating the internal story until something changes in our life, and then we have to change the story. And we change the story in the light of more complex experience. We understand more about it. We can tell it in a short version, like a shorthand version. We can tell it in an elongated version. I think what's hardest is when people are in environments in which nobody wants to hear the sacred story. Yes?
Yes, exactly, you know, what you're saying, that you're in an environment where nobody wants to hear the story. Because I think that in the life we are living, that is discouraged, you know, to share who you are with other people. You try to be as bland as possible, you know, that there's nothing that is particularly different about you. Because I'm interested in people, I would like to talk to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes it feels like, no, you shouldn't do that. You know, you're discouraged from doing that.
So those are cultural norms that, you know, that are discouraging to you because you would like to engage in this process. And so that's often why it's helpful to have one person you know who wants to listen to your story and helps you elaborate it. Because there's so much we don't know until we say it out loud or write it in a journal, or someone responds to some part of that experience, and we see it in a whole new way. So cultures I mean, I grew up in a family which, there were just four of us, my brother and I, and my parents, but we ate dinner together every night, and every night everybody told the story of their day, some important part of it. And we were pretty introverted. And, you know, I used to think my mother was extroverted, then I just realized she was the most extroverted of the other three introverts. And she was so intuitive that she'd get it whether you said it or not. So there was also, you know, how much did you dare say outside? But that opportunity, that invitation to how did your day go, or what was interesting about today, or whatever, that is profoundly humanizing. Profoundly humanizing, because it often gives us points of connection with others that we had no idea existed. So that's a little, it's sad, because there's something in the culture in which you're moving that you feel discouraged to do that, and yet you would like it. So, maybe someone here has some ideas within the community here of where those opportunities might be, because it really is important. And the older people get, the more important it becomes. Because the people who know your stories aren't there anymore. You know, the people who shared those experiences aren't there. So, so unless there are some listening, sharing opportunities, then you're losing part of yourself. Is that the way it feels?
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us. How are we doing? Do we have a time we need to stop? Is there yet one more question, or do people want to kind of engage apart from the large group? What is it? Yes.
Well, I'm delighted that you referred to a situation where two people can live the same story, we'll say, and tell it differently. My brother is always saying, Carol, that isn't how it happened. And I always thought there was something wrong with me. But tonight I know that there's nothing wrong with me. I'm delighted to find that out.
The other thing about being witnesses to the same experience that goes down differently in different stories. My brother is passionate, but he's a sensei thinking type, and I'm an introverted feeling type. So we just have a lot of difference between us in terms of how we relate to reality. But we also did this family thing. We moved to California, and we had family in the Pacific Northwest and family in Colorado. And when we were growing up, the only way we could do that was we camped in every national park between California and Colorado and the Pacific Northwest, because we could only afford a motel every third day. But what happened in those trips were two things. One was that camping was so much fun, and we could pick whatever we wanted to see on the way to visit the relatives, which wasn't quite as much fun at different ages, shall we say. But the other part that I discovered was the stories. The guys told different stories than the women told. And I used to move between the two groups, and the men would shut up when I moved into their territory. And the women were open to whoever was there. But there was a gendering of interpretations of those stories. So what we were actually, even though these vacations were so much togetherness, you thought there was a thing I hadn't observed. But these all-male conversations, I did not observe them. So there were other interpretations among the men in the family about what was going on with James. But, he was a violent man. And I believe what my grandmother said. She could not have made up the story she told. Now, she took care of him when he died. But, I live with the conflict of interpretations over these stories, because I also have to, welcome, my brother did this through research. He also found out that, one family took 2 homesteads instead of 1. He found it in the property documents. It's like he found information that is really true. And I was agonizing over someone in this Folsom family, which, it's the whole history of the U.S. And I said, I don't know what to do. Are we related to so-and-so, 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 so-and-so? He says, Janet, we're related to 6 million people. That line goes back to the 14th century in England, and I don't know where in Scandinavia. Well, one really can't be responsible for all of that, or take credit for it. So part of my musings over this is, having my perceptions questioned and, diminished, as it were. But also of asking the bigger question, what do we do with this new information that didn't shape us and yet is somehow part of us? I think if it puts us in bigger communities, for instance, the fact that we all walked out of Africa, no matter how white our skin is today, it might help us, not other people, the same way. Do you see what I mean? So it's a question, and then some people attach to, well, I'm somebody now. But everybody's a somebody. So it's like that kind of quality of human dignity lives in everybody. We don't have to have a famous relative to prove it. But so I'm just saying those seem to me to be false ways, or not as helpful ways to relate to what we discover about, both the saints and the sinners in our company. So thank you for that comment.
Well, thank you, first of all, to each and every one of you who's come here this evening to support the John McKendy Memorial Lecture. And thank you especially to Dr. Janet Ruffing We appreciate you being here to share how our stories are nested within the stories of others, the complexity of these intersecting narratives across time and place. And we especially thank you for the direction that you have offered us, this opportunity to have our stories intersect with yours this evening. Thank you so much.